You are listening to From Embers, a weekly show on CFRC 101.9 FM about anarchist and anti-authoritarian ideas and practice. We are broadcasting from the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples on land that has come to be called Kingston, Ontario, Canada because of the thievery and brutality of the Canadian state and its empire-loving parents. From Embers is about fires, some real and some metaphorical. Fires started generations ago and tended to over the years. Little sparks all across this territory that we hope will grow, spread, and engulf the thieving state called Canada and the capitalist system that has plagued this land since the fur trade.
This week's episode of From Embers is about resistance to the G7 summit that took place in La Malbaie, Quebec, last week on June 8th and 9th. Uniting leaders from 7 of the most powerful capitalist nations on the face of the planet, the G7 will make decisions that will have a direct impact on the lives of billions of poor people around the world. 10 years following the 2008 crash, the most important point on the agenda will be that of economic growth, or in other words, how to save the capitalist system. It's clear that whichever decisions come out of the G7, the results will not be in our favor. To highlight just a few specific reasons people were mobilizing against the G7, under the neoliberal policies of the G7 states hides an economy based on pillage, maintained by debt and militarization. If Canadian imperialism is often overlooked compared to American imperialism, marked by its numerous Middle East interventions, Canada is nonetheless as violent and complicit. An example is the mining industry. 75% of the mining companies in the world have their headquarters in Canada. Also, simultaneous to the relocation of jobs to countries in the global south in order to exploit low-wage workers there, the nations of the G7 are also increasingly relying on temporary migrant workers within their own borders. The purpose of the border internally, as an ID check, a detention center, or a deportation raid, is to keep immigrant workers who make it into the country precarious and to preserve a racist hierarchy of citizenship. In response to world elites meeting to hash out how to better control and exploit us, people have been rioting and protesting outside of these global summits for decades, often with the intent to disrupt the summit itself. In Canada, the G20 summit in Toronto in 2010 saw large demonstrations and property destruction, as did the 2001 Summit of the Americas in Quebec City. Other summits held in smaller or more remote locations had smaller protests and disruptions, like in 2002 when the G8 summit was held in Kananaskis and protests were held in Calgary and Ottawa. For this episode, I spoke with someone from the legal committee of the RAG7, the Réseau de Résistance Anti-G7, or the Anti-G7 Resistance Network, and with Alex Hundert, an Ontario anarchist. Alex is a member of the main G20 conspiracy group, which you might remember hearing about in an interview with Mandy Hiscox, another G20 co-conspirator, a few weeks ago on From Embers. First, here's an interview with Bob from the RAG7. Bob, could you give us an overview of some of the resistance to the G7 that took place over the past several days?
Yes, it started with a protest on Thursday night. It was a community protest organized with the RAG7, so it was pretty interesting. There were a lot of people, but not as much as we wanted, I guess. We got about 1,500 people. There were easily twice or maybe 3 times as that in police all around the place. It was intimidating, and it was intimidating for a lot of people that were there. On the next day, on the Friday morning, we tried to do an action in Beauport, which is about 5 miles away from Quebec City. We had about 150 people, but there were about 10 times that much in police, so we were kind of kettled from the start. But they just let us, walk within the kettle, and after a while they let us go. So it was an interesting experience, to say the least. Afterward, people met up in spontaneous protests all around the day. People were calling a meeting point a bit at random to try to confuse the cops, and we tried to walk a few times. A few protests actually worked. Most cases, however, the riot cops were there before us, so they were pretty short-lived protests. On Saturday, the last day, was a final protest organized by the unions and by other community groups. A lot more reform, like crowd, the kind I'm talking about, NDP and stuff like that. But the cops were still there in very, very large numbers, so it was very surreal for these people to see that much police all around. We're talking about the standard riot cops, but also police with dogs, police with actual machine guns around the place and looking at us. That was pretty fucking scary. And even as we walked, there were police on every side crowding us and making sure we didn't break any windows, for instance. So it ended up being a very weird weekend. Also, at this point, we got 13 arrests. Mostly for medial stuff. We're trying to see what will happen. People are still inside at this moment because they were forced inside with a very obscure procedure thing, and they were forced to be inside until Monday when the court will open. But we'll see what happened then. So we have a bail hearing tomorrow, and hopefully we can bail everyone out. So that's why I'm still in Quebec City at this point, to making sure that everybody gets out free and everybody can get back to their home safely.
So at the march on, was it Thursday, with 1,500 people, and I guess that being fewer than other summit mobilizations in Canada or in recent times, do you have a sense of why maybe fewer people attended, or how that situation came about?
There's a big factor why people did not attend in large numbers is fear. There was a very, very widespread campaign of fear. A lot of people we usually organize with us said there were no way they were going to be there. There were no way they were going to get arrested there. They said it was suicide for us to try anything. Mm-hmm. The amount of police I've seen there is by a large margin the largest amount of police I've seen. And I must say I've done a lot of protests. I've done the 2012 student strike, 2015 student strike. There were a lot of police there, but I've never seen anything like this. This is another level of stupid, I must say. I mean, every time you walk outside, there were at least 2-3 helicopters around, usually following you. We had people, plain roads officer following us in cars. It was very scary for us, and I understand that a lot of people were scared and didn't want to come for this reason. So that's one big factor. Another factor, I guess, it's hard to organize these days. I guess people are kind of in another mood. A lot of people are more into building instead of protesting, which I think is important too. It's very important to try to build alternatives to the current society. So, but that means that we're less visible in the streets. So I guess it's not a bad thing, but it doesn't have the same impact when you see the news.
Do you think it also might have anything to do with just people's changing sense of strategy, or whether it makes sense to, I guess, show up?
There are changes. We noticed that in the sense that, police have a lot of money. There's a militarization there, but the militarization means also a lot of technology is being used by police right now. So they use a lot of drones for this event, which means that if you have a large protest and you have a small group of 10, 15, 20 people who want to split up and do something else, well, the drone will pick on them very quickly. So that makes organizing actions much more difficult than it used to be. And I think they use a lot of facial recognition software or something like that. They were there were a lot of infiltration too, so they were always before us when we were trying to, regroup at some point. So I'm not sure what the solution is, but this is the current situation. This is where the problem is, I guess.
Mm-hmm. I guess, like with anything, people will have to figure out this new context or figure out how to respond to this kind of police tactics or repression. Yes. and figure out how to do things anyway.
I can, on the good side of things, there were a very large campaign of fear, so the local merchant kind of placarded all their windows with plywood. It was pretty surreal walking in downtown and seeing all these placarded windows. But a lot of people took opportunity of that and started to draw things on the plywood, and a lot of very heartfelt message for the G7, but also some funny stuff, make love, not war, and stuff like that. So it was kind of an interesting context where people were afraid to take up the street, but they were taking other spaces to express themselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, making themselves known or having a different situation than business as usual. Also, with the spontaneous meetings or actions throughout the city the day after, I did hear that the road to La Malbaie was blocked for about an hour, which was impressive given that police response, I guess. What kinds of other things were people trying to do, or?
I don't know. It's a very good question, but I've been, I can't see the forest from the trees.
Yeah.
I've been too busy with the trees right now to see the whole thing. So I've heard that other things have been happening in other cities and outside of Quebec City, but I haven't heard about them, sorry.
Okay.
There have been, to La Malbaie itself, there's been a protest from a kind of a far-right group, which is kind of interesting because someone in La Malbaie itself put out a placard saying immigrants welcome, and the far-right group tried to take it down. They got into a kind of a squabble with the guy there, and one of the racists said, immigrants are not welcome because this is our land. Before we were there was nothing here except some Indians. And it's very interesting to hear that because this is really the perception they have, of the native people, is that before they were, before we came here as settlers, there was nothing here. Well, no, there were people here for like 15, 20, 30,000 years.
Yeah.
And they had cities, they had the roads, they had civilization, and, it tells a lot about the mindset we are currently right now.
Yeah, certainly. It also brings up something interesting, which is the sort of far-right opposition to globalization, or some of the, right-wing rhetoric about free trade. Is that something that people have been thinking about or trying to contend with in the anti-globalization movement, or how does that change sort of the context that people are acting in?
We are pretty worried. We were very worried that the protests will be, with people from the far right. We were pretty sure they would not, disturb our own work because they, like you said, they are also anti-globalization. But as it turned out, some of them came to the protest. There was a lot of them who filmed us and are probably collaborating with police. But in the end, they did not try to shut down our work. But in the long term, this is certainly something we have to be careful about. We had a few groups coming who are borderline, kind of nationalist, identitary stuff, but still on the left. Nazis in the sense that they are national socialists or something. So there's something to watch out in the future.
Are you happy with how the mobilization went, or would you consider it a victory or a success, or do you feel more complicated about it?
I would be much happier if there were much more people. This is kind of worrying, I guess, that people are scared and that people are afraid to take the street. And I understand why, because I was afraid on many occasions. And we had also, I saw one of my friends getting kidnapped in front of me, and there were a number of targeted arrests. They were targeting people who talked to the media. So people who are critical of police were afterward arrested and planted with bogus charges. We're going to see tomorrow what happens for them, but it's very scary at this point. But still, we still managed to disturb the summit in some point, because on Friday they closed down most of Quebec City. Actually, there were 10,000 public workers who did not come into work. They closed 5 or 6 or 10 schools. I don't remember. They closed child care. They closed hospital. They closed a whole lot of things just because we threatened, to disturb the summit. So disturbance occurred despite our very small numbers. But is it a victory or a defeat? I don't know. I wouldn't call it a victory. I would probably quote the well-known militant here, Madeleine Parent, who was a union activist a few years ago, and she said that there's no complete defeat when you're doing struggles for the people, because everybody learns during the struggle. And I think a lot of people learned during this weekend, and I guess this is what's important. This is where we find, I guess, our victory in some way.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that, maybe this is a bit asking you to predict the future, but do you think those experiences will contribute to a sense of momentum, or that a social movement will build in the coming years around these things?
I think the future looks pretty bleak, to be honest. We're going to be stuck, I guess, for a few more years with the far right, and that's not going very well, I think. Beside that, yes, I think a lot of people learned, a lot of people realized that, it's not that hard to organize protests, to organize people and to discuss to people. There's a lot of connection that were made between people who knew barely each other, but now spend 3 days, living together, sleeping together, eating together, protesting together, running together in the most part. So I guess this is invaluable, and that will help us tremendously for the following years.
Certainly those kind of experiences can be extremely powerful for people and for building relationships, and also just confronting the police together is, a unique kind of experience, I would say. I wanted to ask about the infiltration, I guess.
It's very hard to know who's an infiltrator, and it's very dangerous, the paranoia against it, because you can, target someone who's actually a good comrade. So you have to be very, very careful. But we had a few, obvious cases where, people who no one has ever seen ever before or since, with something in their ear, and then all of a sudden all those people are listening to something in their ears and they're running away, and then the cops run in. So, these kind of things are pretty obvious. Those are the obvious ones. And you have also, we had a few cases where people were following us in cars. Well, when we have 2 people in the same car following you for 2 hours, you kind of know that something is going on. Mm-hmm. The real difficulties, however, are the people who are, infiltrating within the group for a long period of time, for 3 months, 6 months, a year or something. Mm-hmm. And this is where it gets difficult and it gets dangerous because of the paranoia and everything. I think my position is to be open to everyone, and hopefully you can convince the cops that come with you that you're not all bad and stuff. But of course, you have to be careful when organizing anything that could be perceived as illegal. But you know what we did in the RAC 7, everything we did was actually legal in some way. We're just organizing protests, organizing transport, organizing lodging. So in that sense, the people who infiltrated the RAC 7 didn't actually get much in terms of useful information. Everything was public anyway.
I guess with the G20 in Toronto in 2010 and the sort of long-term infiltration that happened there, what were people's strategies for dealing with that? Or were people sort of expecting the same kind of long-term or more social infiltration? But I get that organizing only legal things is a particular way to try and minimize the harm that infiltration causes.
Well, I think the way the movement works right now, and I cannot know for sure because everything I organize is purely legal, of course, so is that you have this part of the organization which is completely public and it does only legal stuff, and stuff that are more, media unfriendly, if I may say so. They're organizing themselves elsewhere with people they've known for like 10 years or 15 years, people they've known their whole lives. So you have these two separation, a very clear separation. So this is how I guess infiltration can be at least minimized.
I guess changing topics a bit, with the rise of the far right throughout North America, throughout the world, but I guess in Quebec specifically, were people taking specific steps to avoid being doxxed, for example, or otherwise contending with hostile people that were not the cops, but just racists or other people who were against your movements?
Nothing was really done for the whole weekend because it's kind of weird. We had a few people who were obvious trolls coming to the protest, but we spent 3 days together. At the end, even the trolls were kind of seeing us as friends because, we've been together for 3 days. We've been, facing the cops for 3 days. So more or less that creates links whether you want it or not. Where it gets more dangerous is the doxers, of course. And with those, I don't know how people were, if people were safe enough, and I don't know what the backlash will be. We'll have to keep a close eye on this. And if a lot of people get doxed in the following month, it's going to be a good indication on whether we have to change our tactics for these kind of events.
Mm-hmm. Was there any other reflections you had about the weekend itself or the organizing leading up to it?
Yeah. I mean, it looks hard. It's not that hard. It's a lot and a lot and a lot of work. But in the end, it's worth trying, If you do nothing, nothing happens. If you try, sometimes it works, sometimes it fails. So I guess it's worth it to just try to do stuff. And like Madeleine Parent said, if you succeed, good. If you fail, well, you learn for the next time.
For sure. Well, thanks so much for talking to me.
No problem. Thanks for having me.
You're listening to From Embers on CFRC 101.9 FM.
C'est pas celle qui fait baver. Demande à Fable avec là comme nos semelles sur les pavés. La rage de voir nos putains través, de vivre en travers. La rage gravée depuis bien loin en arrière. La rage d'avoir grandi trop vite. Quand des adultes volent ton enfance, pas imagine un mur et un bolide. La rage, car impossible et cette paix t'en voulu. La rage de voir autant de CRS armés dans nos rues. La rage de voir ce putain de monde s'autodétruire et que ce soit toujours des innocents au centre des tirs. La rage, car c'est l'homme qui a créé chaque mur. Ces barricades de béton, aurait-il peur de la nature? La rage, car il a oublié qu'il en faisait partie des harmonies profondes. Mais dans quel monde la colombe est partie? La rage d'être autant balafré par les piquants des normes. Et puis la rage, ouais la rage d'avoir la rage depuis qu'on est mort. On restera debout quoi qu'il arrive, d'aller jusqu'au bout et de là on veut bien nous mener la vie. On pourra plus se taire ni s'asseoir. Dorénavant on se tiendra prêt parce qu'on a la rage, le cœur et la foi. On restera vu que leurs choix sont bancals, et ben tout équilibre fout le camp. La rage car l'irréparable s'entasse depuis un bout de temps. Car qu'est-ce qu'on attend pour se mettre debout et foutre le bouc? La rage c'est tout ce qui nous laisse, tout ce qui nous reste. Car combien des nôtres finiront par retourner leurs fesses? La rage de vivre et de vivre l'instant présent, de choisir son futur libre et sans leur cri d'oppression. Car c'est la merde et que ce monde y adhère, et parce que tout leur chant OGM stérilise la terre. La rage pour qu'un jour l'engrenage soit brisé. La rage car trop lisse vérité sur leur écran télévisé. La rage car ce monde ne nous correspond pas, nous nourrissent de forêts pour placer leur rempart. La rage car ce monde ne nous correspond pas, où Babylone s'engraisse pendant qu'on crève en bas. On restera debout quoi qu'il arrive, d'aller jusqu'au bout et de là où veut bien nous mener la vie. On pourra plus se taire ni s'asseoir, dorénavant on tiendra prêt parce qu'on a la rage, le cœur et la foi. On restera debout quoi qu'il arrive, d'aller jusqu'au bout et de là où veut bien nous mener la vie. Rien ne pourra plus nous arrêter, insoumis, sage, marginal, humaniste ou révolté. La rage d'y croire et de faire en sorte que ça bouge. D'un Chirac, d'un Sharon, d'un Tony Blair ou d'un Bush. La rage car ce monde voit rouge, mais de cris aille s'entourer parce qu'ils n'entendent jamais les cris lorsque le sang coule. La rage car c'est le pire que nous frôlons. La rage car l'Occident n'a toujours pas ôté sa tenue de colon. La rage car le mal tape sans cesse trop et que ne sont plus mis au bout du jour tant de grands savoirs ancestraux. Trop de mensonges et de secrets gardés, l'élite de nos états riches de vérité pouvant changer l'humanité. La rage car ils ne veulent pas que ça change, ils préfèrent garder leur pouvoir et nous manipuler comme leurs anges. À la rage car on croit aux anges et qu'on a choisi de marcher avec la rage parce que mes propos dérangent, faut aux quatre coins du globe. La rage du peuple, l'ébullition, la rage, ouais la rage ou l'essence de la révolution. On restera debout quoi qu'il arrive, d'aller jusqu'au bout et de là où veut bien nous mener la vie. On pourra plus se taire ni s'asseoir, dorénavant on tiendra prêt parce qu'on a la rage, le cœur et la foi. On restera debout quoi qu'il arrive, d'aller jusqu'au bout et de là où veut bien nous mener la vie. Rien ne pourra plus nous arrêter, insoumis, sage, marginal, humaniste ou révolté. On restera debout quoi qu'il arrive, d'aller jusqu'au bout et de là où veut bien nous mener la vie. On pourra plus se taire ni s'asseoir, dorénavant on tiendra prêt parce qu'on a la rage, le cœur et la foi. On restera debout quoi qu'il arrive, d'aller jusqu'au bout et de là où veut bien nous mener la vie. Rien ne pourra plus nous arrêter, insoumis, sage, marginal, humaniste ou révolté. Anticapitaliste, altermondialiste, ou toi qui cherches la vérité sur ce monde. La résistance de demain, à la veille d'une révolution spirituelle. Rage du peuple, del pueblo. Parce qu'on a la rage, elle qui fera trembler tes normes. Parce qu'on a la rage, elle fait la populace et la rage est énorme.
How's it going? Thanks for being on the show.
I'm excited to be here. It's a great show.
Thanks very much. Could you tell me a bit about how the G7 went, in your opinion, or what kind of the overview of how you feel about it?
I feel generally pretty good about it. Those are some of the biggest marches I've participated in the last number of years. It was very good I got to participate in a big summit protest, which is a lot of, they're fun and they're good experiences if you've been to them. You get to meet a lot of people who think the same way you do. I think as anarchists, often we get caught in what are relatively extremely small bubbles. And by traveling it's not that far away. I'm in Eastern Ontario now for the first time, and Quebec's adjacent. But I got to meet dozens and dozens of people who I've never met before. And, get to feel part of a much bigger kind of community of militant resistance. And generally, there were a gazillion cops on the street, and we refused to do what they wanted us to do. There were only 13 arrests. That's pretty miraculous for dealing with Quebec police, who have a reputation, as people I'm sure know. There were a series of demos, so there was kind of like an overview of what actually happened. On the Thursday night, there was a large anti-capitalist demonstration that I attended with folks from mostly Montreal and Quebec City, I think, but it was there was a large RCP, Radical Communist Party contingent, and a large anarchist black bloc-ish contingent. And then people kind of mingling around between those groups. And I'm sure there were other groups there that I'm just unfamiliar with that had French signs. On Friday morning, we attempted a blockade of the highway to Malabé. I can't remember anymore.
Malbé?
Yeah, that sounds right. And we got surrounded by a gazillion cops, and that didn't work. So we left. But one of the things that, and then we can come back to that later. But then there was another demonstration in the middle of the day. I can't even remember if it was before or after lunch, but there was a big kind of feed the people lunch run by some of the local anarchists, probably IWW. There was a big Reclaim the Streets action that very quickly, after some barricades got lit on fire and the police moved in, turned into a kind of a mobile cat and mouse sort of game with the police trying to catch us running around through downtown Quebec, which is, if you're not from Quebec, it was a great day to be a tourist. I saw a lot of scenic Quebec City between the march and running around. Eventually the cops kettled half of that and held people for a while, but only made a few arrests. Then we had lunch. Then I think that was it for that day. No. Then later that same day, we ended up in the park. We tried to take the streets again, and the cops pushed us into the Plains of Abraham, which is a national park. So normally cops don't even go in there. But they kind of forced us in there, and I guess they were trying to contain us in a corner or something, and one of the park rangers' vehicles got stuck, and the police responded as they usually do when one of their vehicles, when they make a bad mistake and they lose some of their gear. And so very quickly a bunch of riot cops swarmed into the area, and that changed that incident into a police trying to, like, at the same time sort of kettle and sort of disperse people. And then the following day, there was a big union march where we did the big union march thing where we go in a big circle. But it was in, like, the old city. It was really beautiful. And the cops were pretty, like, I wouldn't say berserker because they weren't beating people up, but it was pretty over-policed in extreme ways. And again, you know, one of the highlights of the whole thing was that in that march, the anti-capitalist contingent felt huge relative to what the unions were able to bring out, for better and for worse. And then we got on the buses and came home.
There you go.
That was a long answer. I'm sorry.
No, that's great. Yeah, that's interesting. It sounds like that's maybe an overall positive experience for you, or that it was, like, not the worst, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, as someone who went with few expectations, having not participated in the organizing, having not mobilized people myself, it was a pretty good experience. If I had to assess, you know, if I were an anti-globalization organizer or a national policy activist, how I'd feel about the effectiveness of the whole thing. You know, it sure wasn't it sure wasn't the same as the last time one of those things happened in Quebec City.
Yeah, no doubt.
But it's different times. It's a totally different era. And this didn't, you know, you could have framed it as this being like the tail end of that movement, or this is just something else that sort of resembles what that movement was. I mean, there was no counter summit, there was no convergence, so to speak. There were just some protests, and there were some protests, and people in Quebec and Montreal organized, and some people from out of town came. I mean, we weren't the only people from Ontario there. There were some other groups from other places. And
do you have a sense of why people, maybe why anarchists specifically, were engaging less with this particular summit than they had in years prior? Or, yeah, what's that about?
I think there's a list of reasons. So I think Ontario anarchists got hit really hard by the Toronto summit. And some people are just like, I'm not doing that again. A lot of people were young then, or like even too young to participate. Like, that's 10 years ago now, almost. So never got to see one of those things done, to have a positive experience of one of those things. Which, getting older myself, hanging out with older people in Quebec City, I got to hear a lot of stories about summits from well before, pre 9/11 summits. And having not experienced those myself, I can sort of see what people missed. So it makes sense to just be like, we're over that. And I think for various reasons, there is kind of like almost a consensus that we're over that. I mean, the environmental orgs didn't show up either. And they used to be a huge part of those types of mobilizations. The migrant rights organizations didn't mobilize in force. There were some contingencies, and I mean, it makes perfect sense it's a perfect platform for that issue, but perhaps, and I don't want to speak for the people who do the organizing, but perhaps part of what's going on is that people have come to conclusions that that's not the most effective way to work on those issues. And that as anarchists, rather than so-called progressives, we don't often get the luxury of like getting paid to do our work. So we have to be, as much as the word, it's like a bit of an ugly word, like we have to be somewhat efficient in where and how and when we choose to engage. I also think, like, a flip side reason, and I say this perhaps half tongue-in-cheek, is that, if you're a Montreal insurrectionary, and this isn't from talking to anyone in Montreal, like, this is just like me armchair kind of, so I'm hesitant, but I'm going to say it anyways, is that like, if you've spent the last 6, 7, 8 years kind of anarchy all the time, why would you travel to Quebec City to march in circles and deal with like armies of police when you can just stay home and target things when you feel like it on your own terms?
Sure.
I'm not sure if that's actually a good reason or a reason people are actually using, but I totally get, like, it seems to be a plausible kind of, maybe not a reason, but kind of like a background affect that is sort of influencing things. And then I also think the Hamilton arrests. So I don't know if folks in Hamilton were planning to come, but their resources and attention are elsewhere. The fact that, I don't know how public names have been. So the fact that someone was arrested in Montreal related to those arrests, that gave me pause. At one point I thought I wasn't going to be able to make it. And I was just like, good, if there's like whatever's going on, if there's undercover cops in Montreal targeting Ontario anarchists, do I really want to get on the bus with clack folks? Like,
Sure.
I've already been charged in a conspiracy with clack folks around one of these things. But no, we went anyways. And so those are kind of those are three possibilities. I think the first one, though, is just that, like, people are over summits.
Yeah.
I'm sure if they try to do one in Toronto again, we'll have to deal with it. Same as if they try to do it in Montreal, but it wasn't like this was in Quebec City. It was...
Yeah.
Which also makes the police response so absurd, because what were they even protecting?
I think the police response, as it has been for all of these summits that I can remember, was just really extra. And I could see that factoring into people's sense of strategy or decision making about whether or how to engage with that situation, for sure.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, and I know, as it's been mentioned on this podcast before, that in Quebec, they don't let you even take the road, even in Montreal sometimes. I was listening to, I think, the May Day I don't remember which one, but where people were talking about just getting pushed right off the road real quick.
Yep.
And in Quebec City, they still have a law on the books that says any march that hasn't pre-approved or at least given the route to the police is automatically illegal. So that the folks who won't give their routes to the police literally haven't been able to demonstrate in public off of sidewalks or out of parks in several years now. And so I think that potentially that was one of the things that was big here, so that for people who are young in the movement in Quebec City, they've never got to take the streets in their own town except as part of a permitted march or rally. For me, coming from I started my organizing in Kitchener-Waterloo, where we'd take the streets with 12 people whenever we felt like it. Like, we'd go to Guelph and take the streets with groups of even smaller than that.
Sure.
Sometimes it felt great, sometimes it felt really embarrassing, but we did it because we felt like doing it. And I think that maybe times have changed. Times have definitely changed there, but to be able to say, despite the fact that you can bring all these police in, you can bring all the police in the world in, all we need to do is bring some amount of our friends in, and you still can't stop us from taking the streets, which was a big part of the messaging in Toronto as well, was like, you can turn the city into a fortress, you still can't stop us.
Yeah.
And I do believe that despite the fact that, we didn't burn anything down, except a couple couches, but I believe the message to an extent was still sent, and the police saw people totally unafraid. I mean, we weren't about to charge the police, that would have just been dumb, but I think there were definitely times where it was clear that people were quite prepared to be charged by the police. And for people listening who haven't been in those experiences, it's actually quite liberating, I have found. And maybe that's ridiculously kind of like masculine, macho, whatever. But nonetheless, it is what it is.
No, I think that's real. I mean, I did want to add that I think that I'm actually not sure. I should double check this later. I know that some of the special laws about demos and masks and stuff from the student strike in Montreal were overturned recently-ish.
In Montreal.
Oh, okay, but not elsewhere.
Yeah, so this was what boggled my mind, was that, because I had thought that too. But in Quebec City, it stayed.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, no, and I definitely think that having those experiences together where you realize that the cops actually can't make you do what they want, yeah, that's important, and I think that's an important part of people realizing their own collective power. I wanted to ask you a bit more specifically about the road blockade that people attempted to do. I guess, yeah, tell me a bit more about that. How did it go?
So we were told to assemble in a parking lot at 7:30 in the morning sharp, and by the time I got to the parking lot at like 7:32, arriving on a city bus like half packed full of black like people like. So if you didn't know, you would have looked around the bus and been like, what? There's something, like, if you knew nothing, you would have known something. If you knew anything, you would have known exactly what was going on.
Yeah.
And I think we were all just like keeping our eyes down, trying not to burst into laughter, because it's like a stretched bus, like just like full of people. Like 30 of us maybe got off the bus.
That's funny.
Because there was only one bus that goes there, and it only comes every half hour. Like,
Yep.
but so we got to the parking lot, and you know, it was a lot of people dressed in black, but it wasn't a lot of people. If I compare it, there's no point in comparing it. It didn't feel like there was a support march. So I've been in some somewhat similar actions where we'll have like 150, maybe 200 people kind of in varying degrees of blocked upness, but then also 100 to 400 people just in street clothes with their organization signs or whatever. Mm-hmm. And that kind of crowd wasn't there at this one. And there were just cops everywhere, just everywhere. They had already blocked off almost any way to get to where we clearly were trying to go to, had blocked off the street on both sides. And then as soon as we took the street, blocked off all the exits. And there was just so clearly where it was to some extent theater at that point, because I doubt anybody had any illusions that us marching up and down the street a couple of times was going to create any kind of opening. And at this point, it would, even if they just if they had even left open the road to the highway where we would have wanted to go, it would not have been smart to run to it. Right. So it got called off pretty quickly. But as I was made to understand, even that 20 minutes of standing in the road and refusing to leave when they said, now you have to disperse, and then being able to have that defiance and then actually disperse because they want you to disperse more than they want to have to deal with, kettling and arresting a bunch of people. Again, that's a sense of power, is that if you can recognizing that if you can create enough of a disturbance, sometimes they'll let you go just to have the disturbance end. That's something I learned in part from nonviolent stuff, when you lock people to things. Mm-hmm. If they don't have the right device right on hand, sometimes they'll agree to not arrest you if you agree to leave. Mm-hmm. And this felt but I hate the nonviolent stuff for all kinds of reasons. And this doesn't have that kind of ugly taste to it, despite the fact that it was to some extent theater and a little futile, but trying to do it showing up. Yeah. Calling it showing up and leaving on our own terms, I think counted for something.
Yeah, that makes sense. In terms of the security budget for summits like this, and what people experienced with the G20 years before with long-term infiltrators and all their handlers and all that stuff, maybe it's hard to know in retrospect, I guess, but did you feel like people were taking those possibilities seriously or taking that into account in the time leading up to the G7 this time around?
Yes, I think that I can't speak about everybody, but I feel like there are definitely people, very experienced people my age, who have gone in circles, full circle around the position of how to deal with security several times in their lives, of too paranoid, not paranoid enough, too secure, not secure enough, and have reached a point that is appropriate for now, where they're they've just kind of got it to where it needs to be for what they're doing. Mm-hmm. And while I presume there were undercover cops around me at various points, there were times when I knew there were plainclothes cops. There were times where I was suspicious of people who were probably really cool people. But there at no point was I worried.
That's impressive.
But I've also made dumb decisions in the past. So I may, do I have a good read on this because I've learned from my mistakes, or am I a stupid person to ask this question to? Because, why would you trust my judgment?
I mean, fair enough. I don't know if you want to give a little bit of backstory.
So, for people who aren't familiar, I was part of the group that got primarily targeted around the G20, and we got pretty deeply infiltrated. I mean, at that time there were undercover cops kind of across the country, but our groups were the most deeply infiltrated. So I was part of a relatively small kind of group that existed somewhere between being an affinity group and an actual organization called AWOL. And we had actually let a cop into that group. One of my best friends, who also got accused, one of my co-accused, had an undercover cop living in her house in Guelph, who was in a different set of affinity groups. And, there were affinity groups in Ottawa that were infiltrated, they're just everywhere. Yeah, and so when you come back to the money, I mean, they can only do that level of infiltration with that kind of budget. The Joint Intelligence Group budgets. Mm-hmm. Because for every surveillance, there's 6 cops working for every minute each undercover is working. Mm-hmm. Not to mention the surveillance teams and all. Just ridiculous amounts of time and money. Yeah. But they spent at least $400 million on security for this one, and we could see them. A lot of the cops wearing brand new, beefed up gear. So they have even scarier, more stormtrooper looking shit now than they did last year. And that's part of what these things have become. It seems, at least in this country, it has become clear that there is a model of the reason to host these things in your province is to get a massive infusion. Yes. You get, the Olympics, you get the bonus of the infrastructure boost, the spending, none of it's valuable long term, but you get the economic activity, but you get the investment in the security. And so now, in 2010, we had 2 provinces get it at once, which is how that jig and that surveillance operation got so out of control, was because the $1 billion for the Olympics and the $1 billion for the G20 actually produced what was functionally a single intelligence. By the time it got to the G20, the Vancouver stuff just folded in. Right. Which may, in theory, account for why it may be safer to say that they couldn't have done something like that on a measly $400 million. But they sure had toys.
Yep. Do you think the changing political context this time around had an effect on how people decided to engage with the summit? And I guess I specifically mean the rise of right-wing, populist, anti-globalization rhetoric, or people, governments realizing that they can take advantage of different kinds of anti-immigrant sentiment or sort of people's fear and dissatisfaction with their lives to push an agenda that's Trump style, America for America, this kind of thing.
Short answer, no. Which is interesting because in Quebec City and Montreal, they're very much engaged in fighting, the far right and fascists and the alt-right and whatever. But short answer, no, it didn't feel like that was being brought in. And I seem to be much more worried than locals that those folks were going to show up. And I think they had intel. And in fact, Lamiette was in the free speech zone in Maribay, like, in the fence doing their, like, we hate immigrants thing.
Right.
I saw a couple members at a street festival in a neighborhood in Quebec, and, like, I think they were just from that neighborhood. Like, they looked very at home and in place in this, like... Anyways, I also don't speak French.
Right. Sure.
So I don't know what people
You're
were
not the
saying
person
all
to
the
ask.
time.
Yeah.
And so maybe it was brought in some very big ways that just I totally missed because I didn't hear the chant.
Right.
And also coming from Ontario, I'm used to just like a much more kind of anti-racist, migrant-focused theme to everything than I think is normal in Quebec. So it's actually seemed absent to me.
Okay.
But that doesn't make sense because I also know that like people were literally they're going back and forth between Montreal and Quebec City doing regularly engaged
Right.
in both. So whatever reasons it was or wasn't there to varying degrees, I presume made sense. But I didn't notice. And it's hard to say, like, what the tone of what actually happened at the G7, whether or not that impacted that, because that is very much what was going on, at least from the media side, at the main table. And it didn't actually, like, we were there doing anti-capitalism. So, the message from the street was much more that it doesn't matter what you say.
Yeah.
Like, it's almost like it's a shell game, what they're doing up there. At the head table of the G7, and that whether they are doing, semi-authoritarian populism or progressive democratic socialism, it doesn't, at that level, it doesn't make a f***ing difference. And I mean, it does. It really, really does in the day-to-day lives of lots of people, but also it doesn't.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you have any final reflections on where that experience might lead either you or anarchists generally?
I think that it is important, as much as like theoretically I am really into local organizing and like as local as possible, and think that the idea of national networks is like almost silly if you're an anarchist, and that cross-border solidarity is already recognizing the border more than we should be, like, actually should be doing. The other part of me coming back from Quebec says I live in Eastern Ontario now, and Montreal is closer than Kitchener is, and it felt like there's momentum there, even though like there were a ton of Montreal anarchists who weren't there. What I learned about the dynamics between Montreal and Quebec felt promising, and the energy I saw kind of from both older anarchists and younger anarchists who I've never seen or met before, both they didn't seem to be separate groups of people, and yet both demographics within the a single group seemed pretty invigorated, and given how intensely people have been fighting the far right in Quebec, to have the energy to come out and do this and put it together, it was pretty impressive. So I'm feeling as good about anarchism in this general region as I have in a long time.
Thanks for listening. As always, you can get in touch at fromembers@riseup.net or check us out at fromembers.libsyn.com.